name, tell the story.
Okay. Good evening.
Hello.
My name is Jim Turcotte. I'm from Wethersfield, Connecticut. My dad and his family were all from Lowell, Massachusetts. I went to Boston University and then to law school, and then I worked as a prosecuting attorney for almost 35 years. And then when it came time to retire, I had to figure out what I wanted to do with the next chapter of my life. And I decided that this is what I wanted to do. So this is going to be a chronicle. By that, I mean a timeline. So it's going to go from the early part of the war up through. There's going to be some side trips to other members of the family throughout. And I'm going to be having, because of the dates and times, to go back and forth a little bit between the Atlantic and the Pacific, and then South America. And I'll try and transition when I'm doing that. So it's going to generally follow a timeline, just so you know. There's no way I'm going to be able to cover all the material in the book in the time that I have. So it's basically scratching the surface. For those of you who have read the book, you'll know that there are a lot of stories below the surface. And if this piques your interest, hopefully you'll be interested enough to buy the book. What I want you to think about tonight is what the following people have in common. Jackie Kennedy, Billie Holiday, Jack Kerouac, Jack Lemmon, Bobby Kennedy, and Ed McMahon. Okay, not all of them. Not all of them.
All of them except
Some of them.
all of them.
I grew up listening to my dad tell stories. A lot of dads didn't talk about the war. My dad was the exception. And he and I, at age-appropriate times, would tell me stories about the Navy and of the war, about his family, my grandfather, his brothers and sisters. One who I'd like to give a shout out to, my Aunt Mary O'Connell, who is on the Miracle of Zoom this evening with her daughter. So Aunt Mary, welcome. The heart of the story is about the four brothers from Lowell: Lionel, Bobby, Jim, and Walter, who we call Bud. When I first started out, the book was just going to be about my dad, because that's what I knew most of, the stories that my dad had told. But the more I did research, the more I looked at things, the more letters, the more photographs, the more I knew that I couldn't leave his brothers out, and I couldn't leave the city of Lowell out, because all of those were inseparable. They loved this city. I mean, until the day my dad passed away, his heart and soul was Lowell, Massachusetts. You could take the boys out of Lowell, but you couldn't take the Lowell out of the boys. My great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather, Jim Turcotte, came to Lowell, Massachusetts in 1885. A little town called L'Assomption, which is north of Montreal, just on the St. Lawrence River, just north and west of Montreal. He was a baker. And in 1885, Lowell was in its boom. It was growing, it was bustling. At that time, it was about between 60 and 70,000 people, population at that time. And it was a growing community. You know, by 1920, they had gone to 112,000 people. So this was a town that was really, really growing. And in 1885, they needed businesses to support this growing community. And that's what Nazir wanted to bring to Lowell. He was a baker. And he brought his family with him to Lowell. And for those people who are not from Lowell, Lowell is divided into a number of neighborhoods. You know, the Acre, Pawtucketville, Centralville, the Highlands, you know, as examples of the community. And everybody had their own little areas. They came to the Acre. It was a French-Canadian community. And there was a lot of the mills in the area. And they felt that they could help support the community here. He passed away, Nazir did, in 1905. His son Oswald, my great-grandfather, went to work for Bratz on Whiting Street in the acre. And he started there in 1895. And he was 18 years old. He did odd jobs around the business. After 4 years, he was given the position of head of the bakery department at Bratz. And they were a very well-respected company in Lowell. And in 1915, David Bratt, the last of the surviving sons of the Bratt Cracker founders, had passed away, and Oswald purchased the business. He didn't want to change the recipe. He didn't want to change the reputation. He wanted to keep it as it was because it was so well respected. And Oswald was with his wife, Emelina, and they had a large family, and I'll get to that in a second. But the thing about them was that the cracker was crispy, and it was crunchy, and it was light. My father always said that he thought the secret recipe was the water. He thought that there was a spring under the factory that they used that water, and that was the basis of why that cracker was so good.
Yeah, I worked there.
Did you?
Yes, I did.
We went by where Whiting Street today in the afternoon.
It's gone.
It's gone. And it's been gone for a while. But
Can I tell you that his father was Fred Turcotte?
your father was Freddie?
Yes.
Okay.
And Oswald was my grandfather.
Well, you'll see pictures of your dad.
That's why we're here.
The Turcottes, they worshiped in the community. They lived in the community. They wanted to be good stewards of the community. The tradition that they had, and I'm sure you can back up, is that the neighbors on Saturdays, the tradition in Lowell is that everybody would bake their beans.
Yeah.
And everybody had their own crock. And they would bring them out to the loading dock, and because the ovens, they couldn't shut them off on the weekends. It was too expensive to start them up on Mondays. So everybody would bring their bean crock. They'd load them into the ovens. They would bake them low and slow all day. And at 5 o'clock, everybody came and picked up their bean crock off the loading dock.
Yeah.
And that's not a crock. That's just that was something they did for their neighbors. That's just the way they did. This is Oswald and Minnie, Emelina, on their 50th wedding anniversary, 1948. In the photograph from left to right in the back row, with the dapper shoes, is Eugene. He eventually became a lawyer in Gardner, Massachusetts. To his right is Paul. He was an engineer for the city of Cambridge. Ernie to his right. Now, Ernie, as I understand it, was a heck of an athlete. He was he played semi-pro baseball. And I came across an article from the Lowell Sun, 1927, that said for fun, he skated up the Merrimack River to Hudson, New Hampshire, 18.5 miles each way, just for fun. And to his right, smiling in the background, was Robert. And behind young Emelina in the back was Richard, known as Dickie. He had a career in the military, quite an interesting career in the military. And then smiling in the white suit was Charlie. And then all the way to the right was Freddie. And as I understand, he loves to tap dance.
Yeah.
My Aunt Mary O'Connell, who was listening, told me that a few weeks ago, that he loved to tap dance. Behind Oswald and Minnie was Emelina, their daughter. And to their right was my grandfather, Herman, who was the oldest of the kids. They had 13 children. They all were married. They lost 2 of their children young, Lionel at age of 2 in 1912 and Estelle in 1922 at the age of 2. But they had 11 children, 10 boys and 1 girl, Emelina. And at some point, they all worked at Bratz. That's what they did.
Emelina, we only knew her as aunt sister. That's what they always call her sister.
Okay.
And that's what we knew her as, aunt sister. Everybody's, well, what was her name? Aunt sister.
Yeah.
Well, the Turcottes were a big family, but there was a lot that they married into as well. I mean, if you go through a lot of the names in Lowell, if you look in their tree somewhere, they've got a Turcotte hanging from one of the branches. You know, Helen Willett married Herman. Paul married Amanda Keefe. Arthur married Victoria Byron. Charles married Laura Picard. Ernest married Mabel Toohey. Now, Mabel Toohey, Eileen Lucraft from the Historical Society, her husband's great aunt was Mabel Toohey, who married my uncle. So we didn't know that until we started talking about this book and about doing this thing. I know about the Turcottes. My husband's great aunt married your own great uncle. So then there was Eugene, who married Rachel Barthel. Emelina married Arthur Taylor. David married Loretta Ducharme. Frederick married Margaret Savage. Richard married Jeanette Phillips, and Robert married Jeanette Duguay. Herman, 1918, married Helen Gertrude Willett. They had 8 children, 7 of who survived. Herman worked at Bratz early on, and then there was Lionel, who married Claire Brennan from Lowell. Robert, who remained single. Jim married Doris Matthews from Lowell. Maud, also known as Sis, married Jim Lyman, and then later Edgar Therian. Aunt Mary Turcotte married Jerry O'Connell. Walter married Ann Bakey, and Dorothy married Joe Mello. Helen, her family, the Willets, those are the Willett brothers. On the top center is Thomas Becket Willett, her father. And to the bottom left is Edgar Willett, known as Ed, and to the right is Albert Willett, also known as Bert. The Willets were originally from a little town called Chazy, New York. They're only about 15 miles from the Canadian border, right on Lake Champlain. They were farmers and blacksmiths, and they came here in the early 1880s for the same reason, to work in the community, because Lowell was such a bustling community that, you know, they could support other businesses because of their growing community. In 1883, he married Henrietta Savage, who was from Lowell. This is a Willett family reunion back in the late 20s. You're going on the far left with the green arrow, the boy in the front, that's Lionel on the far left. If you go to the far right, with the blue arrow, that was Bobby. With the red arrow, that was Walter. And with the yellow arrow, that was my dad, Jim. Thomas Becket was in the center with his wife. In the center, just to their left, is Helen, and right behind Thomas was my grandfather, Herman, in the back. My mother was a Matthews from Lowell, Mass. And the Matthews they immigrated into New York City in 1907. The father did, Hugh. And he was here for 2 years as a mason in New York City. Brought his family over in 1909, and shortly thereafter, he had an accident. Family lore has it that he fell off a building and suffered for several days and died on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1909. Now, at that time, there was no retirement. There was no Social Security. There wasn't anything to support a family. There was no safety net. So his wife, Annie Hollywood, took the family, 6 kids, and moved them to Lowell because there was work in the mills for women. And that by the following year, she was already on the census, the 1910 census, for being in Lowell. They had 5 children, Annette Matthews in the center, my mother Doris in the top left, Edward, her brother, in the bottom right, Hugh in the bottom right, and Owen, the youngest, in the top right, excuse me. Hugh down at the bottom, he was the foreman for the pile drivers that built the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. He was a tough guy. He was out there in the water for the whole time that they were driving those piles to set the pillars for the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Owen, he worked for the clerk of he was a chief clerk of the city assessor's office in Lowell. He was an aide to Mayor Ellen Sampson and assistant to the city manager, James Sullivan. But his avocation was music. He played the bass, he played the drums, very musically inclined. He played with the likes of Billie Holiday, Serge Shalaf, Savvy Lewis, and many other local musicians. Annette, she became secretary to the Waitresses Union in Washington, D.C., and we worked with the Secret Service for both the Kennedy and LBJ inaugurals to get the waitresses passed through security so they could work the inaugural dinners for the presidents when they were elected. Herman, he worked at Bratz, but he wasn't a baker. It's not who he was. He was mechanically inclined. He liked working with his hands. So he did a risky thing at the beginning of the, he had kids, and just at the beginning of the Depression, he opened up Turcotte Shell. It was a gas station and garage in Lowell, Mass. During the Depression, people couldn't pay. So he would either give credit or he would barter or trade services. He worked with electricians, plumbers, doctors, all kinds of people who had trades that they could trade services with. And that helped him get through the Depression. The boys, the three oldest, Lionel, Bobby, and Jim, they were referred to as the three Turks. They worked in the garage from a really young age. And they would sweep the floor. They would stoke the fire to keep the place warm. They would hand their father tools. They would start working on cars. They would move cars around the lot. Herman would go to school at night to learn more about carburation, electrical issues. Cars were becoming more and more complicated now at this point, more features. And he started learning about those things and wanted to keep current. And he also took an interest in aeronautics. So he was going to school at night to learn about those issues as well. Lionel was, all three of them were actually, but I think Lionel was the worst. He was the oldest and the leader of the pack. There were quite a group of hellions. And about 12 or 13, they decided they were going to take one of the customers' cars for a little joyride. Now they moved the cars around the lot, but they had never really been on the streets of Lowell. And they took this car out and with his two younger brothers as wingmen, and took a corner a little too sharp and crashed into a parked car. They knew that they were going to get caught, so they immediately confessed to their father when he got home, who brought them down to the two customers' homes and made them confess to them what had happened. And he assured them that things would get fixed as good as new, and that these boys would assist, and they certainly did. And they learned some very valuable lessons from that episode. It wasn't their last, certainly. But Herman, he loved aviation. So much so that he started building planes in his backyard. This is their garage in their backyard. And if you look where the blue arrow is to the right on the screen, that's the frame of an airplane that they're building. And those materials on the ground in front are going to be the canvas that covers it. And the tail fin, as you can see with the number on it, NC31867, is leaning against the door. And he's got some guys from the neighborhood helping him out. And as you can see, it's the same number on that tail. I apologize for the picture. They were, when they were taking pictures in the 30s and 40s, they weren't always great photographers. So, but you can make out the fact that this is the same plane. And when they were done, the engine wasn't on here and the wings weren't on here. What they would eventually get them on, and they would go down Varnum Avenue to the river, and he would use the Merrimack River as his own private runway. Now, if you remember the map, there's that real straight stretch down by Pawtuckaville when you come down, right down to the river. And they brought the plane out there, and then they'd have pontoons in the summer, skis in the winter. And he would deliver the Lowell Sun to Haverhill and to Lawrence and to some of the other Merrimack River Valley towns that subscribe.
Is that the boathouse in the background?
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry.
No, and when they were done, the boys would help load the papers onto the plane. They would take off, nearly hit some of the trees going over. They would, when they landed, they put her over to the side, tie it off to a tree, walk up the embankment and go home. That's what they did. Now, because obviously they spent a lot of time with their dad, both in the garage and in the plane. What kid doesn't want to spend time with their dad in a plane, flying up and down the Merrimack River Valley? So Lionel, the 1938, the Depression was still on. Jobs were still hard to find. He was mechanically inclined. So he joined the Navy. He wanted to be a pilot, but he had glasses. He needed bifocals. It prevented him from becoming a pilot in the Navy at that time. If you wore bifocals, you were disqualified. So the next best thing is that he figured he'd work on planes. So they sent him down to Jacksonville, which at that time was the cradle of naval aircraft. They just opened the base just prior to him arriving in 1938. They brought in a series of Stearman, bi-wing planes. They had sent him to Newport for boot camp. That's Lionel in the front row, second from the left, excuse me. My dad was always good about noting the bottom of photographs or tops of photographs where everybody was. So there's Lionel holding one of the swords in the front of the thing. And off he went to Jacksonville, where he worked at various air bases throughout New England. He was in Maine, he was in Rhode Island, he was in Massachusetts, which was relatively close to home. So he could visit friends, he could visit family, he could visit his girlfriend, Claire Brennan at the time. Claire was quite a catch. She was attractive, she was bright, and she was a heck of an athlete. For the Turcotte boys, having an athletic girl was a wonder. I loved it. In September 10th, 1938, in the Lowell Sun sports section, there was an article about the Grove Bells, an all-girls baseball team, beating the Hudson Tigers, an all-boys team, 3-0. So he knew he had a catch. Right on his heels in 1939, his younger brother Bobby joined up. Robert was known as Robbie. He followed his brother's footsteps, and again, he went to Newport, Rhode Island for boot camp. He also became an aviation machinist, an airplane mechanic, just like his brother Lionel. But he wanted sea duty. So they sent him aboard the USS Cincinnati, a light cruiser, which sent him out to the Pacific. This was 1939, before the war. So he was back and forth between Pearl Harbor, some of the South Pacific Islands, Guam, some of the other places, serving his time. They had float planes aboard the Cincinnati that would get shot off a catapult. So here's a picture that was taken in 1938 aboard the Cincinnati in Vancouver. And the plane, there's two planes in that photograph. This one in the forefront of the photograph has its right set of wings turned in. Both sets of wings can get turned in. When it's time for them to take off, they put the wings out. They rev their engine as fast as it can go. A charge sends it off, flying off the catapult. And if everything works right, the plane will take off. If it doesn't, it crashes into the water. And then there's a crane that will pick the plane up out of the water. And if things go well and they land and the sea is smooth enough, they will land on the pontoons. Sometimes those things, the sea is not as quiet as it should be. It's kind of rough, or that the landing isn't as smooth as it should be. And they capsize the plane as well. In the United States Navy, there's a whole series of unofficial recognitions. This is a certificate to become a Golden Dragon. And it's where a sailor is recognized when a ship crosses a particular imaginary line, like the equator or the 180th meridian. They pass a geographical location, like the Rock of Gibraltar, or up through the Straits of the Dardanelles, or some of the others. Or if you serve aboard a certain type of ship, you get one of these recognitions. Some of those, if you cross the 180th meridian, you become a golden dragon. If you cross the equator, you're a shellback. If you cross both in the same trip, then you become a golden shellback. If you go up the Panama Canal, you become a member of the Order of the Ditch. If you go up the Dardanelles, you become a flying carpetier. You pass the Rock of Gibraltar, you become a member of the Order of the Rock. If you serve aboard a square rigger, you become a member of the Order of the Square Riggers. Bobby got this on December 12th of 1940 on a trip from Hawaii, from Honolulu, and he crossed the 180th meridian and became a golden dragon. This is the esteemed Bartlett Junior High School class of 1936. I don't think, if you look closely at that picture, there's nobody acting out of order. There's nobody doing bunny ears behind the head or making goofy faces. I don't think you could get a group of kids today to make take that same picture. But you have some notables in this. In the far left, under the yellow arrow, is my dad in the class of 36 at Bartlett Junior High School. On the far right-hand side, under the green arrow, that's Jack Kerouac. And under the blue arrow is Ed McMahon. Carnival barker, pitchman, Johnny Carson's sidekick, purveyor of Budweiser, and least known and probably most impressive, he is a United States Marine Corps aviator. He was a flight instructor on Corsairs during World War II, and then he went back for Korea and had 85 combat missions in a single-engine Cessna, where he was an artillery spotter, earning 6 air medals. He remained in the reserves until 1966. Yes?
I know I should interrupt, but I do have a question.
Yes.
Do you know what the teachers are in that picture?
I don't.
Because the very first African-American woman to teach taught at Bartlett and was teaching in the 1930s.
I don't know the answer to that.
Trace Lou.
I think that's a great tidbit.
It is.
I love that.
But I can't, I'm not far away. I can't tell if any of them look like they could be teachers. But anyway, I'm just sharing.
No, I appreciate that. That's a close-up of them in that same photograph. My dad on the left, Jack Kerouac in the center, and Ed McMahon on the right. Right on the heels of their brothers, Jim enlists in 1940. So by 1938, 1939, and 1940, the third of the 3 Turks enters the United States Naval Service. There he is in Newport, just like his brothers. He's in the top right hand of the photograph on the left. And the ship on the right is the USS Constellation. In December of 1940, when Jim graduated from boot camp in Newport, Rhode Island, those of you who have been to Newport, what's the weather like in December in Newport?
Cold.
Yeah.
Cold,
Windy.
raw, windy. The Constellation was served there. It had just been recommissioned, and it was the oldest warship in the Navy's fleet at that time. And that was my dad's first ship.
Wow.
So he served his first tour right out of boot camp, and the oldest warship built, it was the sloop of war built in 1855, put in the water in 1855. Couldn't be real tall and stand up in some of the lower decks, and you had to sleep in a hammock. So you tied up your hammock at night, and in the morning you untied your hammock, you put it in your locker, and because they had other things to do with that space. Well, there was always a wise guy, my father said, that when you went up to go to the bathroom or whatever, you'd untie your hammock, put it with a slip knot, and then when you jump back in your hammock, you hit the deck real hard. So, so Jim got his first recognition his first week out of boot camp because he became an Order of the Square Riggers. He was one of the few people that could say they served on a square rigger ship. Jim, at that time, because they were not at war, brothers were allowed to serve together on ships in the Navy. And so he got a brother transfer to be with his brother Bobby aboard the Cincinnati. Now, so he had to traverse the world trying to find his brother Bobby because they can't tell you where the ship is for security reasons. So you had to find out from other sailors, hey, did you get anybody run into the Cincinnati? Anybody got any information as to where the Cincinnati is? Sometimes the information was 6 months old. Sometimes it was 2 months old. Sometimes it was 2 weeks old. But the ships of the U.S. Navy never stay still for very long. So they're always moving. So Jim boarded the USS King. It was an old 4-stack destroyer. And they were heading through the Panama Canal to the Pacific, and that's where supposedly his brother was. And he was going to find his brother and do his transfer. For Jim, unfortunately, they lost his pay records. They don't know where they went, whether they stayed on the King, whether they went to the Cincinnati ahead of him. But he made his way through, and as they were going down the East Coast, first 4 or 5 days, Jim was sick as a dog. He was so seasick. During the day, he would be scraping the decks of the ship. At night, couldn't go down below decks because he was afraid he'd get sick and he wouldn't be able to make it back up the stairwell. And he'd have to clean up after himself. So where those blue arrows are on the rear portion of the ship pointing upwards, those are torpedo tubes that are aboard the King. And he'd peel off the end cap and he'd sleep in there. Because that way, if he had to get sick, he could jump out and run to the rail. So this happened, for 3 nights, 4 nights. During the day, he was in the sun, he was dehydrated, he wasn't eating, he wasn't sleeping. And finally, on the 5th day, a boatswain mate told him, "You got the watch," which means where that upper arrow is, pointing to a can up on the mast in the front. It's about 45, 50 feet up. And he had to climb that mast, climb into that bucket, and sit there for the next 4 hours. Dehydrated, sick as a dog, sunburned. And he knew if he got sick, those guys down below were not going to be happy with him. And the thing about being on this is a destroyer, the King. They both go up and down and sideways. So the pitch and roll. So when you're up on that thing, it's like riding an amusement park ride because it just kind of goes round and round and round. And you can imagine how he must have felt after 4 days in the sun and dehydrated and losing everything. But he stuck it out with grit and determination, white knuckled himself in there. He made it through his 4 hours and he made his way through the Panama Canal and he became a member of the Order of the Ditch. Now, when he got to the other side in the Pacific, got some information, he switched to a number of different ships, including the Colorado, which is a battleship. He went to the Trenton, he went to a couple of other freighters or troop carriers, back and forth between the mainland and Hawaii to Guam, everywhere he was to try and find his brother Bobby. He finally makes his way back to San Francisco in early April of 1941. And he finds that Bobby and the Cincinnati have gone east. They've been assigned to the neutrality patrol in the Atlantic between South America and Africa. And they were trying to prevent the Germans and Japanese, because remember the war for Europe was started in 1938. And they wanted to prevent the Germans and the Japanese from resupplying. So they were trying to stop U-boats and freighters and all of the like. So that's what the Cincinnati was doing. So Jim decided, this is it. I've had enough. I'm giving up my brother transfer. And he takes the first ship that he can, which was the United States, the USS Northampton. USS Northampton was a heavy cruiser. It was named for Northampton, Massachusetts. He was given a position as storekeeper, and his battle station was the portside 5-inch gun placement. The Northampton was assigned to Pearl Harbor as an escort to the USS Enterprise, along with several other ships. Jim's in Hawaii and having the time of his life. Now imagine this kid, 19 years old, from Lowell, Massachusetts. He had swum in Lake Althea up in Tingsboro. He swum in the Merrimack River. Never really gotten too far out of Lowell, maybe a trip or two to Boston, but that was about it. And here he was in Honolulu, Hawaii, on Waikiki Beach, having the time of his life. For him, it was paradise. He cruised the Pacific. They visited Brisbane, Australia, and Jim crossed the 180th parallel at the equator on their way to or from Brisbane, Australia, and he became a golden shellback. 50 guys on his ship. They were there for 3 weeks in Brisbane, Australia. 50 guys got married to Australian women. And remember, the Australian men were at war. They've been in war since 1938. Well, the Australian women love the Americans and the Americans love the Australian women. So 50 of them got married. When it was time to leave, those 50 guys stayed in Australia. So they went AWOL. So they weren't disciplined. They had to report to the chief of police once a week, tell them what they were doing. And the next time that the Northampton was in town, they expected to be on board. Things start to heat up in the Pacific. This is getting to be late 41 now, the fall of 41. These are the scout planes that are assigned to the Northampton. And you can actually see it on one of the forefront picture of the blaze down at the bottom is the Northampton written on it. And it's a similar situation to what Bobby had, the planes that shoot off. It's a biplane. And those were on the Northampton. The Northampton escorted the Enterprise out to Wake Island to deliver some airplanes out at Wake Island. Things were starting to heat up. They were scheduled, they left in late November of 1941, and they were due to be back December 6th of 1941. They ran into some weather, which slowed them down. They were refueling between ships, and an accident occurred where there's a large fuel line that's between the two ships, and there's a large rope line that holds that big gas line. They shoot it over to the other ship, they haul it aboard, hook it on, and they refuel between ships. Well, that cloth line, the regular rope line, got caught in the propeller of one of the ships, and they had to stop and send a diver over the side and get it done, which delayed them even more. On December 7th of 1941, at 8 o'clock in the morning, they were about 200 miles from Pearl Harbor, and they were woken to a general alarm. You know, general quarters, this is not a drill. Pearl Harbor is under attack. Now here's these sailors, you know, my father's 19 years of age. The place that they called home for the last 9 months is under attack. You can imagine they're angry, they're frustrated, they can't be in the battle. They know that where they've been, they've got friends who are aboard other ships that are there. So they sent one of those planes out, and it came across a Japanese Zero that had been damaged at Pearl Harbor and was making its way back, and they shot that Japanese Zero down. They were the first ship in the Pacific to shoot down a Japanese Zero outside of Pearl Harbor, is my understanding, on that day. And they were very proud of that, that they were the first to get into the war. They arrived the morning of December the 8th of 1941. This is an actual photograph of the Northampton coming into Pearl Harbor down the channel. And if you look, it looks gray and cloudy. That's smoke from the fires. That's not clouds. That's not mist. When they went there, everything was burning, everything was smoking. There were recovery operations going in place. Pulling guys from the water. You can see there was a small boat in the front of the picture going through the harbor. They're trying to save guys. They're trying to recover bodies. They had to go into their berth. They had to restock, because remember, they didn't know whether there was going to be another attack coming at this point in time. They just knew that the place had been taking serious damage just the day before. So they went in. As a storekeeper, as part of his responsibilities, food, medicine, supplies, things they needed, and they needed it to be done in 24 hours. So everything, new ammunition, and that's what they needed to do, and be back out to sea, and back out to sea they were on December the 9th of 1941. Japanese started taking island after island, making their way across the Pacific. The first offensive battle of the war, where the U.S. fleet became involved, was the Battle of Wochi. Wochi was an island in the Pacific, which had been controlled by the Japanese. We went in. The picture on the left is the 5-inch port side gun mounts. So somewhere in that, either on the top or in the middle or the bottom, there's a good likelihood my father's in that photograph. That was during the Battle of Wochi at the 5-inch gun placement on the port side. On the right-hand photograph is the island of Wochi. You see two things burning from the island. One was a munitions depot, one's a fuel depot. And you can see one of the planes from the Northampton in the foreground of the photograph there. They were using to spot for the ship, radioing in so they could send in their artillery, the 8-inch guns and the 5-inch guns to go from there. It was a complete success for the Americans. When they came back, they got permission to do a very unusual thing, which was to put brooms across the front bow. And that's called a clean sweep, that they swept the enemy from the sea. It's very rarely given. But after Pearl Harbor and what they did on that day, the commanders of Pearl Harbor allowed them to do that. And when they came into Pearl Harbor with the crossed brooms, all of the ships in the harbor started sounding off to congratulate them. Remember, the Enterprise and this group of ships were really the only warships that were left of the Pacific Fleet. There were a lot of freighters, there were a lot of other things, other types of ships, but everything in Pearl Harbor had been damaged or destroyed. And so what they mostly had was the Enterprise and the ships that surrounded. From that point on, the Northampton took on a new name, the Fighting Nora, and it started from December 7th, shooting down that Japanese Zero, to Wochi, to Battle of Wake Island, Marcus Island, Doolittle's raid in Tokyo, Bougainville, and the Santa Cruz battle. Colonel James Doolittle was given the task of flying Mitchell B-25s off the deck of an aircraft carrier. Never been done. This is the Hornet. And the Hornet trained and trained and trained, and the Northampton was right alongside and watched those Mitchells take off. And they had to leave several hundred miles earlier because they'd been spotted by a Japanese boat. And they were afraid it had been radioed in. He was right alongside, and the planes were heavier than they thought they would be because they had to put more fuel in them. And each one of those planes nearly touched the ocean as it took off. They would wait. The ship pitches, the aircraft carrier pitches, it doesn't roll. So it's going up and down, and they would try and time it so that they would start the engine and roll down as it was down, and time it so that when it was at its apex, you give it a little extra lift. And each time it would just drop down just below decks, almost hit the water and get off. My father said his heart was in his throat every single time. This was an article that was in the Lowell Sun a year after Doolittle's raid. As you recall, nobody knew where they took off from. It was a secret because all the islands close to Japan was controlled by Japan. So when FDR said where they came from, they went from Shangri-La. And that's where it was a mythical city. And it was often, this mission was often labeled as Shangri-La thing. He had a ringside seat to that as well. You watched the Wasp, the Yorktown, and the Hornet sunk during 1942. One of the things I always loved about my dad, my dad was a boxer. He loved to fight. And if you look, almost every photo of my father, he's got a shiner. His left eye. Almost every picture of him, he's got a shiner. But that's where he is in that one. So these are the three aircraft carriers. While my father's out in the Pacific, Bobby's in the Atlantic, and he's aboard the Cincinnati, and they're doing now, it's 1942, the war is on. Now they have a blockade. It's not just a neutrality patrol, it's now a blockade. And they are going to bomb or destroy or seize any U-boat, any freighter, anything in the like that they can. They got information on November the 14th that the Annalise Esberger was going to be in the area, and it was a German freighter bringing materials to resupply, and so they came across the ship. They told it to stop. It gave a fake name. They went to approach it. The Germans set off explosives. They got into a motorboat. They set off explosives to scuttle the ship. And they nonetheless took the Germans captive. They seized materials from aboard before the ship sunk and brought them back to Recife. Recife was the Blue Arrow, is the port which they were working out of in Brazil, where you can see where they were covering. This map was actually a map taken from the Annalise Esperger. You're going to see the map a couple of times, only because it shows the area that they were in. But this showed the areas where they knew that the patrols were and the areas that they thought it would be safe to go. But unfortunately for them, it wasn't. They were taken prisoner and returned to it. Bobby, on 3 separate occasions, he was a great swimmer. All the Turcotte boys were, but as we talked about, the planes taking off, on 3 separate occasions, planes were capsized in the water. And Bobby literally dove off the ship and would take a line and he would tie it to the ship and allow that plane to be taken back aboard by the crane without losing it. I mean, if you lose a plane, you're losing manpower, you're losing your ability to scout, all kinds of things, and it's more money, which the U.S. Navy didn't have at the time. So he was given recognition on 3 separate occasions for his heroism in terms of recognition for saving 3 of the float planes from the Cincinnati. So that was November 21st of 1942. We moved forward to November 30th of 1942. The Northampton had gone through 7 battles without a single scratch. It was a very, very lucky ship. They survived ship-to-ship torpedo attacks, kamikaze attacks, all kinds of things. They were able to survive 7 battles without a single scratch. November 30th, 1942, Guadalcanal was in full swing, the Battle of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was a heavily fought campaign on both sides. My Aunt Mary's husband, Jerry O'Connell, was on Guadalcanal. He was wounded and earned the Purple Heart. Everybody that was in the Navy knew somebody or was related to somebody that was on Guadalcanal. For them, this was personal. Both sides were trying to supply their people with weapons, with food, with medical supplies. We wanted to stop the Japanese, and the Japanese wanted to stop us. We had gotten information that during the evening hours of November 30th, 1942, they were going to be supplying Guadalcanal with more Japanese soldiers and supplies. And we were going to stop them from doing that. So this is a nighttime battle, setting the tone. Is described by both my dad and by the after action report of this battle. There was no moon. There were no stars. It was pitch dark. There was no light pollution from any of the islands. This is out in the middle of the Pacific. We didn't have cities like Lowell and New York City and Boston where you had light pollution. When you looked up the stars in the sky, it looked like diamonds against black velvet. I mean, they were so bright. But on this particular night, no light whatsoever. They couldn't see their own ships in front of them, never mind their enemy ships. And they came through, and the first part of the battle was very successful for the Americans. They had struck a number of freighters, troop transports, and the like, doing a very, very good job. When they came back around the island, they were in battle formation, which means there's one in front of the other. And it was like an amusement park, arcade game where the ducks line up and you just one after another. Except this wasn't a game and the consequences were deadly. The first ship to go through was the Minneapolis. Minneapolis was hit. The Japanese were using long lance torpedoes. That's the variety they called. They were very accurate, very deadly, very reliable. And it blew the bow right off the Minneapolis. A couple of 100 yards back comes the New Orleans into the same area. The New Orleans, the bow gets blown off. Everything from the major gun at midships forward was lost into the ocean, and everyone with it that was there. The Pensacola came through, hit abreast of the main mast, 2 torpedoes. The Honolulu swerved out. The next ship swerved out of the battle formation and was missed. And the Northampton was last. And she came through and took 2 torpedoes simultaneously to the rear quarter of the ship. And the top view of this diagram, this is a diagram from the after action report by the United States Navy. That's where the fuel tanks are. So when it got hit, it was one right at the water line and one about 10 feet below when they struck simultaneously. They only felt one impact. And it sent fuel and vapors up over the mast, the rear mast, and everything ignited. It was like a Roman candle. And the bottom 2 views are looking down from the ship, so you can see how much damage went in when you're looking down on the ship. From one was one deck and one was a deck below it, the amount of damage that was done to the Northampton. There's fires going on. She was struck at about 11:45 on the evening of November the 30th. She starts to list. There is an order to abandon ship. My father stayed on. A young sailor asked him to take a fire hose up a ladder to a gun emplacement area. There was a sailor that was stranded up there. And the 2 of them started pouring water to try and get to this kid. They fought this fire for about an hour or hour and a half. They got a Marine captain to come through, and he went into the smoke and fire to try and rescue this kid, when all of a sudden the water was stopped. They started pouring water into the ammunition areas because they were afraid that the fires were going to set off and it would just explode the ship. So they couldn't save that young boy that was up there. And that was the thing that always bothered my dad, that they weren't able to save the kid. He was ordered to abandon ship to the salvage crew, and he was in the water until daybreak when the USS Fletcher came through and picked up all of them. So that was on the morning of December the 1st of 1942. He was sent to a survivors camp in Noumea, New Caledonia, at the Dumbia River. While Jim is in the survivors camp, where everybody either got malaria or dysentery or both, Lionel was getting married shortly thereafter. Lionel was still serving in the States at the time. And on December 26th of 1942, he married Claire Brennan. Claire's aunt was, I think both aunts actually were teachers in the Lowell school system, Emma and Ruth. This was an article from the Lowell Sun, December 28th of 1942. They had planned on a long honeymoon, but the Navy had other plans. This is the wedding photo. Walter is on the far right-hand side. He's 15 or 16 years of age. Freddie is up there and on the far right, and then Lionel, and then Claire, and Claire's aunt, and Claire's best friend, Dorothy. I think Dorothy McGuire was her name. So they were married at St. Rita's Church here in Lowell, and only within a week he was transferred to Boca Chica, which is down in Key West, Florida. Claire went along. They were there for a period of time. It was hot. He was not happy there. A lot of mosquitoes and bugs. But he was spending a lot of time flying rather than just fixing planes. He wasn't the pilot, but he was acting as one of the crew. And they would go on these, what they would call raiding parties, to go to other bases and try and steal parts that they needed for their planes. So they went up to Sanford, Florida on May 6, 1943. Lionel wrote a letter to his mom and dad saying, I said hello to Claire today, about 4:30 on my way back from Sanford, from about 500 feet at 300 miles an hour. She thought we were coming right in to see her. I was on a raiding tour trying to get some rear wheel tires from the thing. Jim, meanwhile, when he got back from the survivors camp, applied to become an officer. So he applied to what they call OCS, Officers Candidate School. And they sent him to Harvard. He had wanted to go to Notre Dame, but to his chagrin, he went to Harvard, and that wasn't a bad thing for him because he'd be back close to home. He'd be in Cambridge, Mass. You can see another shiner in that photograph there. He always took somebody's right, I think. Somebody coming around to the right. You need to keep that right up. But he'd been aboard the Iowa when he applied to Canada School. He spent 1943 to 45 in Harvard, and he tried to get home as often as he could. His classmates in his class were Bobby Kennedy, Jack Lemmon, and John D. Rockefeller III. Almost every night, not every night, but almost every night. My dad would go into the next, they call the house, he lived in the Elliott house, and the other house was the Kirkland house. And he would go into the Kirkland house where they had a piano. My dad loved music. And he would watch Jack Lemmon play piano almost every night. After dinner, Jack Lemmon would play piano. Later went on to become a great actor. While he was at Harvard, that's him at Harvard, right at Harvard. My dad's on the far right-hand side. He took some pictures of Lowell. The top is the mighty Merrimack Dam, as he wrote on the back of the photograph. Yeah. And then the top photograph, that's his inscription on the back, the Golden Gate of my homeland, Pawtucketville. Yeah. So that's the way he felt about Lowell. And I gave my cousin Patty a picture tonight from the same group of photographs taken. This was in 1940, late 43, early 44. It was before her dad joined the service. So Bobby in 1943 is still down in the South Atlantic. He's been promoted to chief aviation machinist mate. He's now a crew chief aboard this biplane here. And they are doing what I call double patrols. They send off a set of planes in the morning for 3 or 4 hours of flight, searching. And then they'd come back, they would refuel, they'd get something to eat. They'd send up another set of teams in the afternoon. The morning went fine on January 4th, 1943. The afternoon flight, the companion returned, but Bobby's plane did not. They made radio contact with the Cincinnati saying that they had to land. They were having some trouble. There was another garbled message that they didn't understand. And for the next several days, both planes and ships searched over 40,000 square miles of the Atlantic, not to find one single trace of them. Not an oil slick, not a piece of the wreckage, nothing. They don't know what happened. So Bobby, his mom was declared missing in action, and his mom received this telegram. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your son, Robert Thomas Turcotte, Aviation Chief Machinist Mate, U.S. Navy, is missing as a result of not returning from an airplane flight at sea while in the performance of his duties in the service of his country. It took the Navy almost 10 days. They were living over on 113 Barnum Avenue at the time. It took almost 10 days to get from the time that he went missing to get the telegram to the house. Lionel goes from Boca Chica down to Dutch Guiana, where the blue arrow is in South America. It's now Suriname, country of Suriname. At that time, it was a Dutch colony of Dutch Guiana. And there was an airfield there called Zandri Field. And they were flying bombers, Ventura PV-1 bombers, out of there for the purpose of bombing U-boats and freighters in the Atlantic. They were enforcing the blockade. He was promoted to aviation chief machinist mate. That's him there. I know you can't tell by the photos, but he had really blue eyes. So the ladies really loved his smile and his blue eyes. He always had a smile like he was up to no good or knew something you didn't. Photo on the left is Zandri Field, where the yellow arrow is. That's one of the bombers on the runway. And on the right is an example of a Ventura PV-1 bomber that they were using to bomb the U-boats. On February 17th of 1944, one of the PV-1 bombers had developed some engine troubles. They worked on it. They brought it up for a test flight. A fire broke out. They radioed that they were returning to Zandri Field, but it crashed about 3 or 4 miles into the jungle before they could reach Zandri Field, and all 5 hands were lost. The bodies were recovered by the search crew. And unfortunately, their mom, Helen, had to receive a second telegram. Navy regrets to inform you that your son, Lionel Oswald Turcotte, an aviation chief machinist mate, was killed in a plane crash in the performance of his duties in the service of his country. The photo on the right is his funeral. Because it was a Dutch colony, these were Dutch sailors that acted as pallbearers for their fallen American comrade. Aunt Mary provided me with that photograph when I was researching the book. He was buried there. They only had a temporary cemetery. That's where he was buried. Now imagine, timing is everything in life. 1943, Bobby goes missing in June. In February of 1944, Lionel is killed. In June, 1 year and 1 day after he went missing, the Navy declared him dead. That same month, Walter graduates from high school. He's 17. He's seen his brothers come home at various times from the service in their uniforms. He's the youngest. He's 17, and he needs his parents' permission to enlist. They've just lost 2 sons. Helen was a regular parishioner at St. Rita's Church. She had already spent a lot of time there praying for her sons in the Navy. When her son Walter decided he wanted to go, she obviously spent a lot of time praying and discussing and thinking and deciding what they should do. There was debate, prayer, discussion, reflection, and eventually they consented. And they brought him to the enlistment office of the United States Navy. And on his application, I asked him why he wanted to enlist. He said, duty to the country. Unlike his brothers, he wasn't sent to Newport, but he was sent to Sampson, New York, to the U.S. Navy Training Center in Sampson, New York. I remember he was a 17-year-old kid in boot camp. At this point in the war, 1944, a lot of the people that were being drafted or going in were much older than he, 3, 4, 5 years older than him at least. You know, he wrote home to his mom saying, "Can you send candy? They don't have candy up here." I mean, it just goes to show you, you know, he was a young kid. You know, this is a firefighting training that they were doing that summer that he was there, and he may even be in that photo. But I was able to obtain that from the training center they have a museum in Sampson, New York, and they were kind enough to give me permission to use that photograph. From there, once he finished his training, they sent him out to Fort Ord in California. He started out in Monterey and then to Fort Ord for further training. He was being trained as a civil affairs member. At the same time that he's heading out to California, Jim's graduating from Harvard and midshipman school at Fort Schuyler, New York. And from there, he's given orders to go off to San Francisco. He's been given orders to his next ship. Those are his 3 pals. His 3 pals, Joe Grilly, Jim, my dad, and John Abden were in the center. That's taken in San Francisco at a supper club called Charlie Lowe's. Walter was sent to Okinawa at the height of the Battle of Okinawa in early May of 1945. The Japanese knew that if Okinawa fell, it was likely that the Americans were going to then invade Japan proper. So they fought with everything they had. For those of you who saw the movie Hacksaw Ridge, about Corporal Desmond Doss, you know what I'm talking about. Although Bud was in a civil affairs unit, not an infantry unit or a combat unit, there was no safe place in Okinawa. He survived an ambush by a Japanese soldier, but not without having to take that Japanese soldier's life. And at 18 years of age, that can be a very heavy burden to carry. My father was given orders to, his next ship was going to be the New Orleans, the same New Orleans that had his bow blown up. That's a photo of the bow of the New Orleans after Tassafaranga. And on the right is with the new bow put on. Everything from the back of that Blue Arrow forward is a brand new bow. So you see the two sets of guns on the front of that ship. The first one, towards the closest to the bow, that was blown off. That was not there anymore. Where you can see is that the second set of guns in closest to the mast, that's the one that's showing in the photograph on the left on there. So Jim had to get to the New Orleans, but the New Orleans was in Korea. So he had to stop in Okinawa. So Walter and Jim were on the same island. Walter was in the north and Jim was in the south, not 50 miles apart, and they never saw each other. Here they are in the middle of the Pacific, 5,000 miles from home, and they're within 50 miles of each other, and they don't get to see each other. Walter saw some great things on Okinawa, the children, the photo on the left, and the burying of American soldiers for as far as the eye could see. These were photos taken by Walter while he was over there. The war ended. The bombs were dropped. My father was given a new assignment to the USS Missouri, became the assistant navigator of the Missouri. Walter was given a new assignment, the USS Providence. The USS Providence was in the Mediterranean, so he had to get there by way of the Missouri. So what were the chances that the two Turcotte brothers, they missed each other on Okinawa, but here they were on the Missouri. Not only that, because of the way the life works, he put Walter in Jim's unit, and his big brother was now his superior officer. I don't care where you're from, or how old you are, or how young you are. Younger brothers don't like taking orders from older brothers. They didn't stay together too long, but they made their way to the Mediterranean. Walter made his way to the Providence. They ended up taking a tour around the Mediterranean. Jim, they had brought aboard the Missouri, the ambassador of the United States from Turkey had passed away in the United States, and they were bringing his body back for burial. And then they cruised the Mediterranean. So on the top right photograph is the funeral of the ambassador of the United States from Turkey. They had a private audience. The Missouri had a private audience with the Pope. And that's the chaplain of the ship kissing the Pope's ring. And those are some of the ships, the Missouri and the Power and a Yugoslavian cruiser. They came back, Jim and Walter both came back to Lowell late 46, early 47. Jim was recalled to the USS Des Moines in 1951. That's him under just above the yellow arrow. And he stayed, my dad stayed in the reserves until 1983. Turcotte Square was named for Lionel and Bobby over at the corner of Varnum Avenue and Ticket Boulevard over by the hospital. We just went by there today. There's a new sign. Yeah. This one, it's a new beautiful sign, and I'm very appreciative for having had it fixed. My grandmother, Helen, she looks older there. She's 60 years old in that photograph. She's younger than I am now. And to her right is Jackie Kennedy, who was Senator Jack Kennedy's wife at the time. You look at the flag, 48 stars. It was 1958. Yeah. Bottom left, 1963, that's the East Coast Memorial for those who were lost at sea in the Atlantic during World War II. Bobby's name is inscribed on one of the large granite tablets. And in 1948, Lionel's body was returned to Lowell for burial. Claire, she, 1945, married Jack Monroe. She had enlisted as a nurse in the United States Navy, and married Jack Monroe, who was a survivor of Pearl Harbor. And that's them on the right many years later in the 1990s. She reminds me of Donna Reed, the actress from It's a Wonderful Life. Has a very strong resemblance.
Yeah.
Lionel, his awards were not on his DD-214. DD-214 is his discharge summary from the Navy. But it appears he's eligible for at least 4, probably much more than that. World War II medal, the Navy medal, the American Campaign medal, and the Good Conduct medal. Bobby won the World War II medal, the United States Navy medal, the American Defense medal, American Campaign medal, and the European, African, Middle East Campaign medal. Walter had the World War II medal, the American Campaign Area medal, the Asiatic Pacific Area Campaign medal, and the ribbon with star for the Battle of Okinawa, and the Good Conduct medal. Jim had the Asia Pacific Campaign medal, the American Defense medal, the Navy Occupation medal, the Europe and Asian Class American Campaign medal, the China Service medal, World War II Victory medal, and the rest of those. He had 8 battle stars when everything was done. This is Jim and Walter later on in life. Two brothers. There's my dad, 91.
Man, that always cracked me up.
That's my dad right there. That's the guy I remember from.
He doesn't have a black eye though.
No. I'd like to thank Focal Press and J. Thomas Hetrick, my publisher. That's the end. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has about any topic.
Who had the forethought to have your dad record all the war stories?
I did. When he was in his